Hey guys, welcome back to our fifth part of Testing Bad. In this episode, we will be talking about integration tests of a Spring Batch application by using TestContainers for Apache Kafka. So, what is TestContainers? So, TestContainers is an open source project that allows developers to run Docker containers directly in their project, right? So, as the name speaks for itself, we are going to use it on our tests. We have already a video talking about test containers, so now let's use it on our Spring Batch application that writes the items to Apache Kafka. So if you remember, we have a previous video that we were using Spring Batch composite item writer. So we were writing the data to MySQL and to Apache Kafka. So we have already a video that talks about test containers with database. So in this video, we are going to talk about test containers for Apache Kafka. So let's go. So before doing anything else, remember that we are using the composite item writer, okay, the branch. So let's take a look to our job configuration where we have JPA item writer and Kafka item writer. So we are going to test now the Kafka item writer because we have already here the test containers for database. So in that order, the first thing that we need to do is to go to the page of TestContainers, okay, website, where we have here some instruction. But for us, let's first grab the Maven dependency for test containers of Apache Kafka. So let's go. So let's use our dependency here. Let's reload our project. All right. So now the next thing that we need to do is to provide a container for Apache Kafka. So in that order, let's follow the same approach as we did for database. So let's use the static because we want our container to be initialized once, okay, for a test class. So let's keep doing. Now let's instantiate our Kafka container. So we can just call it by Kafka container. So as always, okay, we need a Docker image. So the Docker image that we are going to use is the latest from the official documentation. So this is the image. Let's just copy and paste it here. So this is the way that we declare our Kafka test container. Of course, you can go further by using, for example, Zookeeper and connecting with a network. But for this video, let's just keep it as simple as we can. So now let's start also our Kafka container. So the next thing is also to add our Kafka Bootstrap server, okay, into our context. So let's do it. So the way that we add, okay, you can just go to, for example, Spring for Apache Kafka or Spring Cloud Stream, and you will understand how to get the Bootstrap. But for Spring Kafka, let's use Spring Kafka Bootstrap server. And the way that we get Bootstrap servers is mostly the way that we were getting here, for example, the database URL and username. So in that order, let's use the Kafka container and let's get the Bootstrap servers. So now that we have here our Kafka Bootstrap server, okay, we have added it on our dynamic property registry. So we will have this property on our environment. Now let's move to our sales info test. So this is just a test provider. So of course, for example, you can use other annotations of test containers by, for example, using the @TestContainers. So this annotation is for JUnit Jupyter extension. So as you can read here, this will activate automatically the startup and stop of containers. Okay. So and we can, for example, add a combination here as container. So now let's go to our test class. So we have here. So remember guys, we have two tests here, right? So we have this first one and the second one here. And once we add here, for example, this annotation at container, it will, as I was telling you guys, that it will start the container for us, okay? And as we put it as static, okay, it will create only once for all our tests, okay, that we have. So it will create one, okay, once the container for both tests. Sometimes you need it, sometimes you don't need it. Of course, it depends on what you need. So let's go. So if we take a look here on our configuration of our job, okay, we can see that we only have sales info item writer. So how can we test a Kafka, okay, component that writes the items to Kafka? So in order to test that, first approach that I can think is by creating a reader, right? So we are writing, we need to have a mean to read what we were writing here, right? So in that order, the first thing that we are going to do here, we are going to inject here the Kafka template for our reader. So this is the Kafka template. As we know that we have the key as a string and the value as a sales info. And let's just call it by reader. So now that we have here our reader, it's not enough, okay? So this is just a Kafka template. It doesn't mean that it's gonna read already our, let's say like our items from a topic. So I think the next thing that we need to do is we need a mean to configure, for example, our consumer, right? So in that order, the first thing that we are going to do, we are going to provide here a, let's say like, let's use properties, okay? The Java util properties, consumer property. And now we need to configure our consumer property. The first thing that we are going to need, okay, we are going to say, okay, these consumer properties, let's just first instantiate it. And now let's start adding some configuration. For example, the consumer property, we are going to set a property. The first property that we need to set, so this one, the Kafka Bootstrap servers. So how can we get, okay, this property? If we can see here, we are using the dynamic property registry. In the previous video, I already explained what is it. And now we need to get the property. So how can we get that property? For myself, I like to use the environment, okay? So let's just use the environment from Spring, okay? The Spring Framework environment. And let's call it by environment also, okay? Let's inject the environment. So in that order, let's use, okay, that environment. Let's use the environment in order to get the property, okay? So the name of property is, right, the key that we have already added on our dynamic source, on our test container providers. So let's call it by, for example, the same name, right? So this is the Kafka Bootstrap servers, okay? So this is the way that we get the property, okay, from our environment. So we were adding here, okay? So we added here, this is the key, right? And in order to get it, okay, there are a lot of, you can use different ways to get it, but I like to use the environment from Spring. So now that we have here our Bootstrap servers, okay, the next thing that we need to do is, okay, let's just configure our consumer Bootstrap servers. So in that order, let's use the consumer config, okay. As we can see, it's from Apache Kafka, consumer configs that. Now we need to get the Bootstrap servers config, okay? So we are adding it, okay? Now let's use the Kafka Bootstrap servers, okay? This is the first config that we need to add. The second configuration that we need to add is, for example, the consumer group ID, okay? The next configuration that we need to add is, for example, a Kafka key, the serializer, and value the serializer. So if we take a look here on our application property, we can see that we before, okay, when we were creating the Kafka item writer, we specified the producer key serializer, and also we specified the producer, okay, value serializer. So as we are testing, if we send, okay, the event or the items correctly to Kafka, we need to specify also the consumer key, the serializer, and consumer value, the serializer. So let's do that. So for key, the serializer, okay, we are going to use the string, the serializer. I think we can just get, for example, the name, as it needs its string, okay? Now, let's use also for the value, okay, the serializer. So what is our value? The serializer is a JSON, okay, the serializer. So remember, guys, don't mess up, because we have here, for example, the spring, okay, as we can see here, the spring JSON the serializer, and also we have the TestContainers JSON the serializer. So we are going to use this one, org, spring, Kafka, and so on, okay? So I think it's not necessary, but we also need to add one more configuration, okay, one more property for our consumer, which is, for example, we are going to say, okay, every package, okay, is trust. So in that order, let's just use the JSON, the serializer, okay, remember it should be the Spring framework, and yeah, let's use the trust package, the trust packages, and let's say all, okay, that's all. Let's format our code. Yeah, so this is what we need, okay. I'm doing it on before each, okay, maybe it's not the best approach, but it's just I'm just trying to show you guys how you can create, for example, a consumer on an application that you just have a producer. So yeah, that's good. Now let's go to our test, and our first test, this one here, okay. Now let's add, for example, assertions for Kafka. So now let's add the assertions here. But before, we need to say, okay, that the reader, okay, this reader, the Kafka template that we call by reader, okay, it should have a consumer property and a topic, right? Because we want to read, okay, so from a topic. So in that order, let's use this reader, okay. This reader, let's say like this reader is equal new Kafka template, and now we need to add, okay, these consumer properties, right? And also we need to add the topic that we are going to read. So before adding the topic that we are going to read, we need to know, okay, this is the topic that we are writing on our application. So in order to read, we are going to read, okay, from this topic. So in that order, let's just use it here. My bad, okay, it's not a Kafka template. It's not a Kafka template. It should be a Kafka reader. Kafka item reader, okay. So here, instead of Kafka template, okay, it's Kafka item reader. Of course, it makes sense, right? Because we were using on our application the Kafka item writer, okay. So here, okay, we are using the Kafka, okay, item reader. So here also it should be the Kafka item reader, which accepts, okay, a consumer property and the topic name. So in that order, now that we have our reader here, and I think for this test we can just use, for example, the reader that let's set maybe the poll timeout, this reader set the poll timeout. It receives the Java duration, okay, let's say duration of seconds. And for myself, let's wait, okay, 5 seconds, okay. Later you can play with all this configuration in order to understand. So now the next thing that we need to do is just, for example, here say that, okay, our reader, and as it's a Spring batch, okay, we need to open the context, okay. So this way we have already here. Now let's start asserting, okay. So what we are going to do, we are going to say, okay, this that reader, okay, that read. So we are going to read, okay, using all these configurations that we have created here. So let's say, for example, sales info, it will take a sales info from our, okay, topic that we were just, when we run our application, we are writing, okay, to this topic. And now in our tests, we are using TestContainers with Apache Kafka, and we are reading, okay, from there. So now, okay, let's just, for example, use the assertions. Assert not null, okay. The first thing we are going to assert if the sales info is not null. And the next thing maybe that we can use is by, I don't know, let's just also say, okay, that sales info, okay, for example, that get seller, I think, yeah, get seller ID is not null, and so on, because we are sending a lot of some data, okay. We don't know, for example, the we can use the contains in order to see if some name matches, okay, but you can play it with it later, okay. So for example, like this. So let's take a moment in order to understand what we did here, guys. So the first thing that we did was we add here the Kafka container, okay, and we use the image, okay, that we just got from our documentation. We start, okay, we use the deep start, okay, to start our Kafka container. We also add these two annotations here that I just explained, and using the dynamic property source, we add this property here, which is the Spring Kafka Bootstrap servers, okay, and the actually Bootstrap servers we got from the Kafka container. And next, on our test, okay, the first thing that we need is a Kafka item reader in order to read, right? And also we add here a property that we call by consumer property, and also the environment. And then we start adding some properties in order to create our consumer properties, okay? Just like, for example, the Bootstrap server that we got from environment, okay, by passing the key. And here on our test, we just use the Kafka item reader, okay, instantiating it. We just specify the sales info, okay, as our topic. And then we start polling, okay, using the Kafka reader, and then we assert. So now let's run our first test. So we got here an exception which says that at least one partition must be provided, of course, okay, my mistake. So let's provide, for example, here the partition will be 0. So now that we have here our partition, now let's run our tests. Actually, let's just run this first one here that we have here. Okay, let's run in debug mode. It's gonna take some time, okay, because the annotations that we had here, okay, they will start up and turn down the containers for us. These annotations here, which in my point of view, it takes a little bit, okay, on the first time, but we are going to improve it. So now we have here our breakpoint. As we can see, now when we read, okay, using the Kafka item reader, now we can get the event or the item that we just sent. As we can see, okay, this is what we have here. The assertions here, I just made it simple, but of course you can, for example, create your expected data and start validating if the expected data is the same as actual. Okay, so this is what we have here. Okay, and in the end we can see that our test, okay, passed. And if we take a look here, okay, we are actually using the Kafka broker, okay, from the test container, right? And yeah, so as we can see, we have here all this stuff here. As I was telling you guys that, okay, we can use this annotation, but actually we don't need it in our case. Okay, now if we run once again our test, even in debug mode, okay, we can see it's going to be a little bit more clean. Okay, so as we can see, it's waiting the database to be available. Okay, and here we have, for example, here, as we can see, the test containers, okay, is using Docker, and it was creating the image, okay, the same image that we specified here, and also this one here, okay, and yeah, it will run, or it will start the container for us, okay, the both containers, as we can see here. And yeah, for our tests, it will wait, okay, once the database and the Kafka will be available, and we will execute our tests. Okay, of course we could use, for example, the library awaitility, okay, in order to give more control whether we need to wait or not, or how long we can wait, okay, so and so on. So as we can see here, okay, now it's better, I think, okay, it's better than the previous example that we just run. So this is what we got, okay. We have provided some infrastructure, for example, the Kafka and database, and you can keep playing with test containers, for example, LDAP, Redis, or something else. So hope that you enjoy this video, and don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel, guys. So thank you, and see you in the next video. Bye.